Welcome to another episode of American Scandal Report by Scoob. I'm your host, Oz Dalton, and today we're diving deep into one of the most explosive political scandals of the 19th century. A tale that involves America's favorite spirit, a president's blind loyalty, and a conspiracy that nearly brought down an administration. This is the story of the Whiskey Ring scandal. Picture this: it's the late 1700s, and along the muddy banks of Kentucky rivers, flatboats loaded with oak barrels are setting sail for southern cities. Inside those charred barrels, a golden liquid that would become America's signature spirit, bourbon whiskey. Named after Bourbon County, Kentucky, this wasn't just any drink. By law, bourbon could only be made in the United States, distilled from a mash containing at least 51% corn, and aged in brand new, charred oak barrels for a minimum of 2 years. But bourbon's story isn't just about craftsmanship. It's intrinsically tied to rebellion and politics from its very birth. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1791 in Pennsylvania changed everything. When angry distillers rose up against spirit taxes, President George Washington made history by becoming the first president to use federal troops against American citizens. The rebellion was crushed, but its impact was profound. Many distillers packed up and headed south to Kentucky, the future birthplace of bourbon. These weren't just any refugees, they were craftsmen who would shape American drinking culture. The mint julep, originally made with peach brandy until bourbon took over. The old fashioned, created at the Pendennis Club in Louisville and brought to New York by Colonel James E. Pepper, a Kentucky whiskey distiller who understood that great bourbon needed great marketing. By the mid 1800s, bourbon had captured the attention of America's most powerful men. Abraham Lincoln, raised in Kentucky, knew the spirit well. But it was another president who would become forever linked with bourbon in the most scandalous way possible: Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's name would be tied not just to bourbon appreciation, but to a conspiracy that would shake the very foundations of American government: the Whiskey Ring. The stage was set. American bourbon was booming, taxes were high, and where there are high taxes and valuable commodities, corruption inevitably follows. The bourbon industry was about to become the centerpiece of one of the most audacious tax evasion schemes in American history. Enter General John McDonald, a former steamboat operator with expensive tastes and flexible morals. Here was a man who had fought alongside Grant, earned his trust, and parlayed that friendship into one of the most lucrative positions in government: Supervisor of Internal Revenue for Arkansas and Missouri. Grant had appointed McDonald believing he was putting an honest man in charge of cleaning up corruption. Instead, he had just handed the keys to the kingdom to the future kingpin of the largest tax evasion conspiracy in 19th century America. McDonald's operation was breathtakingly simple and devastatingly effective. For every 70 cents in taxes that should have been paid on a gallon of whiskey, the money was split. 35 cents went to the distiller, and 35 cents went to the ring. But McDonald wasn't just stealing money, he was building a political machine. Those stolen whiskey taxes flowed directly to Republican politicians in Missouri, funding campaigns and buying loyalty. Grant, the honest soldier turned president, had no idea his old friend was using bourbon money to corrupt the very party Grant led. The audacity of McDonald's operation becomes clear when we examine Grant's visit to St. Louis. McDonald didn't just host the president, he put on a show that revealed both his wealth and his character. Grant, a passionate horse enthusiast, entered his colts in a local fair competition. Standing in a pagoda in the center of the arena, Grant watched his horses compete against superior Kentucky thoroughbreds, fully expecting to lose. But McDonald, serving as judge, awarded Grant's clearly inferior colt the blue ribbon. Grant's reaction tells us everything we need to know about both men. The president was disgusted. This wasn't the behavior of a friend, it was the manipulation of a corrupt politician. Grant expressed his displeasure and walked away. But McDonald wasn't finished. He presented Grant with a pair of fast horses, complete with wagon, harness, and gold breastplates, engraved with the president's name. It was a gift that would have cost thousands, money that, unknown to Grant, came from stolen whiskey taxes. But McDonald's most calculating move involved Grant's aide, Orville Babcock. The Whiskey Ring ensured that Babcock had an unforgettable encounter with Louise Hawkins, known as Sylph, a beautiful blonde who would become central to the conspiracy's eventual exposure. The genius of McDonald's operation lay in perception management. When Grant confided his concerns about Republicans losing Missouri, MacDonald had the perfect solution. He would use whiskey money to support preferred candidates. The volume of stolen funds was so enormous that MacDonald could channel money to candidates in other states. The ring distributed bribes liberally among Washington insiders, creating a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. Most cunningly, MacDonald encouraged his co-conspirators to believe that Grant himself was aware of the operation. MacDonald never explicitly claimed presidential approval, but he fostered the impression that his friendship with Grant provided protection. This gave the entire conspiracy a false sense of security, while keeping MacDonald as the only direct link to the president. The downfall of the whiskey ring began with something as simple as telegraph messages signed SILF. These weren't love letters, they were coded warnings that would ultimately expose the conspiracy and threaten to bring down a presidency. By late July, Treasury Secretary Benjamin Bristow had confirmed the unthinkable. The SILF messages were written by none other than Orville Babcock, President Grant's most trusted aide. In these telegrams, Babcock was warning MacDonald about impending federal investigations in St. Louis. One message was particularly damning. Babcock assured MacDonald that he had successfully blocked an investigation and that no federal action would be taken. The name Sylph was no accident. Louise Hawkins, the beautiful blonde who had entertained Babcock during Grant's St. Louis visit, was known by this nickname. By using her name as a signature, Babcock created what he thought was the perfect cover. Anyone intercepting the messages would assume they were romantic correspondence. Instead, they were evidence of obstruction of justice at the highest levels of government. The web of deception became clear when Grant received a letter from his friend William D.W. Barnard in St. Louis. Barnard had spoken with the lawyer representing MacDonald and Joyce, and what he learned was devastating. The lawyer claimed that MacDonald and Joyce weren't worried about prosecution because they were confident Grant wouldn't betray them, or else Babcock would be compromised. Grant's reaction was immediate and furious. The suggestion that he would obstruct justice was repugnant to his soldier's code of honor. He passed Barnard's letter to Bristow with a forceful note. No guilty person should be spared, and investigators should be especially vigilant against anyone claiming influential protection. Grant authorized Bristow to publish this directive in the Washington Chronicle on August 10th, hoping to restore public confidence in the investigation. But the damage was spreading. Bristow warned Grant that enemies were trying to create the appearance of discord between the president and his Treasury Secretary. These false allegations, repeated by those claiming Grant's trust, were undermining the investigation's credibility. The confrontation over the Sylph telegrams created an impossible situation. When Bristow showed Babcock one of the telegrams, Babcock admitted writing it, but claimed it had nothing to do with the whiskey ring. Bristow warned that Babcock might be indicted and felt obligated to show the evidence to Grant. But Babcock had already gotten to the president first, convincing Grant that the telegram was about a routine supervisor transfer, not whiskey conspiracy. Bristow's response revealed the depth of the deception. He pointed out that the transfer order Babcock claimed to reference had been issued months after the telegram was sent. The timeline made Babcock's explanation impossible, but Grant's loyalty to his aide was unshakable. As the grand jury prepared to convene in St. Louis, Bristow predicted Babcock would be indicted. Despite mounting evidence, Grant refused to demand his aide's resignation. For Bristow, this was heartbreaking. He believed the president was being manipulated by someone pretending friendship while acting with complete deception. Grant's character was both his strength and his weakness. As Bristow observed, the president seemed more concerned about wrongfully accusing an innocent person than about forgiving a guilty one. This noble instinct, which had served Grant well as a general and leader, was now being exploited by the very people closest to him. The whiskey ring scandal placed President Grant in an impossible position, caught between his personal loyalty and his presidential duty. As the investigation intensified, Grant found himself facing a choice that would define his presidency: stand by his closest aide or pursue justice regardless of personal cost. The unfolding scandal captivated the entire nation. Newspapers across the country followed every development as federal investigators worked their way up the conspiracy hierarchy, starting with distillers, gaugers, and storekeepers before advancing to internal revenue agents. Bristow, feeling enormous pressure, confided to a friend that he was embroiled in a battle against powerful moneyed interests and unscrupulous criminals. Initially, Grant's fury was directed at MacDonald, but Babcock's influence over the president was remarkable. In late May, Grant expressed complete confidence in MacDonald to Bristow, citing his close relationship and trust with Babcock. Bristow's response was alarming. He informed the president that MacDonald was at the very heart of the fraudulent activities and was currently in New York with $160,000 of stolen money, ready to flee the country at the first sign of arrest. By this point, Bristow had recognized Babcock for what he truly was. He confided in Secretary of State Hamilton Fish that Babcock was deeply involved in the whiskey ring, maintaining extensive and confidential connections with the worst criminals in the conspiracy. But Grant, being fundamentally honest himself, found it impossible to believe that his closest aide could be so thoroughly deceptive. The tragedy of Grant's situation becomes clear when we consider Babcock's character. Here was a Vermont native who had graduated with honors from West Point, an intelligent man with a black goatee and handlebar mustache, possessing a smooth and persuasive demeanor that had completely won over the president. During Grant's summer retreat to Long Branch, the clever and deceptive Babcock was constantly by his side, reinforcing the president's trust while secretly coordinating with criminals. Babcock's correspondence, preserved in his papers at the Newberry Library in Chicago, reveals the depth of his deception. In letters to his lawyer, he defended MacDonald and Joyce, claiming their prosecution was unfair persecution. He insisted that his own letters couldn't be misinterpreted by any honorable person, while simultaneously admitting that MacDonald possessed letters that could incriminate him. Most tellingly, he suggested that MacDonald might be willing to part with these compromising letters for a bribe, advising his lawyer to obtain and destroy them. The power of Babcock's manipulation was so complete that even decades later, Grant's son Jesse maintained belief in Babcock's innocence. Jesse praised Babcock's selfless nature and willingness to help anyone, considering every acquaintance a friend. This testimonial shows how thoroughly Babcock had convinced the Grant family of his noble character while engaging in systematic corruption. As grand jury indictments mounted in late July, the evidence against Babcock became overwhelming. The Sylph messages proved he had warned MacDonald of impending investigations, effectively obstructing federal law enforcement. Yet Grant's loyalty remained unshaken, even as the scandal threatened to consume his presidency. Grant's letter to Bristow, published in the Washington Chronicle, represented his attempt to separate his personal relationships from his presidential duty, by declaring that no guilty person should be spared and that investigators should be vigilant. Against those claiming influential protection, Grant was essentially giving Bristow permission to investigate his own aide. Yet when it came time to act on this principle, Grant's personal loyalty made it impossible for him to abandon Babcock. The aftermath of the whiskey ring scandal reveals the complex calculus of power, loyalty, and justice in American politics. As the conspiracy unraveled and convictions mounted, the real drama shifted from courtrooms to prison cells, where desperate men made increasingly dangerous threats. Joyce and MacDonald, once the masterminds of the largest tax evasion scheme in American history, now found themselves behind bars, facing the prospect of years in federal prison. But these weren't men who accepted defeat quietly. Both began issuing threats, claiming they possessed damaging information that could destroy reputations unless they received presidential pardons. Joyce's letter to Orville Babcock reads like something from a crime thriller. He wrote that he and MacDonald had stood like rocks in the ocean against the turbulent waves threatening Babcock and the president. His question was pointed and threatening. Would their courage and resilience be overlooked? The implication was clear. Their silence had protected higher-ups, and they expected compensation for their loyalty. MacDonald's approach was even more direct. Through his attorney Chester Crum, he asserted that he possessed enough evidence to prove his actions weren't malicious or vindictive. His demand was simple: freedom or confrontation. Crum's message to Babcock was carefully worded. He claimed ignorance of any information MacDonald had that could harm the president or anyone else, while warning that MacDonald might stir up an uncomfortable dispute. Crum advised Babcock to view MacDonald's threats as the desperate cries of a sick man pushed to his limits. These weren't idle threats. Both men had been at the center of operations that reached into the highest levels of government. They had receipts, correspondence, and intimate knowledge of how the conspiracy operated. In their minds, they had sacrificed themselves to protect others, and they expected their loyalty to be rewarded. But Grant wasn't a man to be blackmailed. The threats had no significant impact on the president, and his Attorney General, Edwards Pierrepont, rejected MacDonald's initial plea for freedom. However, human suffering eventually moved Grant where threats could not. After MacDonald spent 14 months in prison, his health deteriorated dramatically. The former steamboat operator, once robust enough to run a multi state conspiracy, was now genuinely ill and possibly dying. Former prosecutor David Dyer, who had helped convict MacDonald, advocated for a pardon on humanitarian grounds. 5 weeks before leaving office, Grant granted MacDonald's request, citing severe and life threatening illnesses. It was an act of mercy, not capitulation to threats. Grant's treatment of different conspirators reveals his complex moral calculus. While he pardoned MacDonald and granted other whiskey ring pardons during his final days in office, he notably refused to pardon Joyce. Despite Attorney General Taft's positive recommendation, Grant opposed Joyce's pardon, leaving him in jail. The difference wasn't in their crimes. Both men had been equally guilty. The difference was in Grant's personal assessment of their character. In a revealing conversation with Babcock, Grant mentioned that he thought MacDonald was a better man than Bristow, the Treasury Secretary who had exposed the conspiracy. This comment shows how Grant's personal loyalties coloured his judgment even after the truth was revealed. He held a grudge against Bristow, whom he considered a traitor to their friendship, while maintaining some respect for MacDonald, who had at least been directly loyal to Grant personally. Throughout this process, Babcock acted as a secret intermediary between the Missouri convicts and the administration. Although he didn't require a pardon, having avoided conviction, his future was uncertain as Grant's presidency ended. The president and Mrs. Grant continued to welcome Babcock at the White House, and Grant continued seeking his advice on various matters. In a final act of loyalty, Grant arranged for Babcock to join the Lighthouse Service, ensuring continued government employment. As they ended their official relationship, Grant praised Babcock's integrity and efficiency, expressing gratitude for over 6 years of faithful service as private secretary. While the whiskey ring scandal was reaching its dramatic conclusion in Washington, the bourbon industry itself was facing its own trials and tribulations. The scandal had damaged the reputation of American whiskey, but it was just one of many challenges the industry would face over the coming decades. In the late 1800s, the bourbon industry confronted a new threat, the Whiskey Trust, a conglomerate that aimed to control the entire American whiskey market. This monopolistic organization sought to dictate prices, control production, and eliminate competition. However, legal pressure eventually dismantled the trust, preserving the diversity and competition that would define American bourbon. The industry's reputation concerns led to landmark legislation in 1897, the Bottled in Bond Act. This law was directly designed to maintain the quality and reputation of bourbon whiskey after years of scandals and adulterations. The act required bonded whiskey to be aged for at least 4 years in government-supervised warehouses and bottled at exactly 50% alcohol by volume. For the first time, consumers could trust that their bourbon met specific federal standards. But the industry's greatest challenge was yet to come. Prohibition, lasting from 1920 to 1933, devastated American whiskey production. Some bourbon distilleries managed to stay operational by supplying medicinal whiskey to pharmacists. Yes, doctors actually prescribed bourbon for various ailments during Prohibition. However, most American whiskey producers were forced out of business entirely. During these dry years, smuggled Canadian blended whiskey filled the void left by bourbon. These lighter, smoother spirits captured American palates, and when Prohibition ended, public taste had shifted dramatically. Bourbon sales remained depressed until the 1980s, as Americans preferred these lighter products to the bold, corn-forward flavors of traditional bourbon. The bourbon renaissance began in the late 1980s, when the industry started introducing premium whiskies. Distillers began emphasizing quality over quantity, craftsmanship over mass production. The market in the early 21st century saw more bottlings than at any time since Prohibition, with new marketing terms like single-barrel bourbon and small batch bourbon emerging to distinguish premium products. These terms sparked some controversy among purists, but bourbon aficionados generally agreed they signified high-quality products. However, experts emphasized that age statements, indicating how long bourbon was aged in the barrel, remained the most critical quality indicator. Today's bourbon boom represents a complete transformation from the scandal-ridden industry of the 1870s. Modern distilleries operate under strict federal oversight with every aspect of production regulated and monitored. The same government supervision that the whiskey ring sought to corrupt now ensures product authenticity and quality. The irony is profound. The whiskey ring scandal, which sought to cheat the government and consumers, ultimately led to stronger regulations and oversight that benefit today's bourbon drinkers. Every bottle of bourbon you purchase today carries tax stamps and meets federal standards that trace their origins to the reforms implemented after Grant's administration. The whiskey ring scandal exposes how loyalty, ambition, and corruption can intertwine in American politics. President Grant's trust in Orville Babcock, though noble, was exploited by criminals to siphon tax revenue for personal gain. Hidden messages, bold conspiracies, and audacious deception shaped a scandal that tested the limits of democracy. But what secret evidence lay hidden in the Sylph telegrams? And how did these revelations almost topple a presidency? Download the Scoob app now to uncover the full story, witness every shocking twist, and see how American institutions ultimately triumphed. The Whiskey Ring's lessons in power, betrayal, and resilience await you, along with the hidden stories that history books often overlook.